Turkey was already on the table when my brother-in-law leaned back in his chair, patted his stomach like he owned the place, and said, "You know, Caroline doesn't really need a life outside of this. What else is she going to do with all that money?" Everyone laughed. My sister laughed. Her kids laughed. My mother pressed her lips together and looked at her plate. I didn't say anything. I just set down my fork very slowly, looked at my laptop bag sitting by the front door, and thought, "I've been waiting for a reason. Thank you for finally giving me one." But let me back up, because if I just tell you what happened at that Thanksgiving dinner, you won't understand why I was so calm. And that calm, that's the part that still surprises even me. My name is Caroline. I am 31 years old. I work as a senior financial analyst at a logistics firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been there since I was 24, started at the bottom, got promoted twice before I turned 28. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because it matters to understanding how I ended up in the situation I was in, and how I got out of it. My sister Diane is 4 years older than me. We were never the kind of sisters who shared clothes or stayed up whispering secrets. She was the popular one. I was the quiet one with a spreadsheet for everything. She got married young, 23, to a man named Greg, who had a lot of confidence and not a lot of follow-through. He'd been in sales, then in real estate, then doing consulting, which as far as I could tell meant working from the couch in basketball shorts and taking calls he made sound very important. For the first 2 years of their marriage, I kept my distance. I sent birthday cards. I showed up for the holidays. I was pleasant. But then Diane called me one February night, crying so hard I almost couldn't understand her. Greg had lost his latest job. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage. They had 2 kids under 5 and nothing in savings. I drove to their house the next morning. I looked at their bills. I made them a spreadsheet. Because of course I did, and I sat across from them at their kitchen table and I said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." I paid their mortgage for March. Just March. That was the plan. Then April came and Diane called again. Greg was in between opportunities. Could I just cover 1 more month? They'd pay me back as soon as things settled. I said yes. I keep thinking about that yes. How easy it came out. How reasonable it felt at the time. They had kids. They were struggling. I had money. It seemed simple. What I didn't understand then, what took me almost 4 years to understand, was that I wasn't helping them over a bridge. I was becoming the bridge. By the end of that first year, I wasn't just paying their mortgage. I was covering their utilities, their car insurance, their streaming subscriptions. Diane had added me to their grocery delivery account just in case. And somehow, just in case had become every week. Greg asked me once, casually, like he was asking about the weather, if I could add him to my Costco membership because it just makes more sense financially. I did it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they were grateful. And honestly, Diane was, at first. She sent thank you texts. She called to check in. She said things like, "I don't know what we'd do without you, Caroline." And I think that's what I was feeding, if I'm being honest. Not just their bank account. My own need to be needed. I'd spent my whole life being the invisible sister, the practical one, the one nobody worried about because I always figured things out. And here was my chance to matter, to be essential. Greg never said thank you, not once. Not a single time in 4 years did that man look me in the eye and say the words. What he did do was get comfortable. Faster than I expected. Within 6 months of me covering their bills, he stopped pretending to look for work. He started making suggestions. Could I get a bigger Costco order? Could I look into a better internet plan for their neighborhood? Did I know a good accountant who could help them with their taxes, meaning could I pay for one? I started to see it in little ways. The way he'd talk about my job at family dinners. "Oh, Caroline's always working. You know how it is when you're climbing the ladder," said with a smile that made it sound like I was missing something important. The way he'd look at my car, a used Acura I bought sensibly, and say something like, "You should treat yourself more. You've got the income for it." Like my not spending was the problem, not his not earning. But I kept paying, because Diane needed it, because the kids were young. Because I told myself it would end when Greg found steady work and I just needed to hold on a little longer. Then my mother started adding her voice. Not intentionally. She was just worried about Diane and Greg, and she'd say things like, "You're so good to them, Caroline. You're holding this family together." Which sounded like a compliment but landed more like a rope being tied around my wrists. My therapist, yes, I had a therapist. She was wonderful and I should have listened to her 18 months before I finally did. Told me that I had built a role for myself in this family system, and that the role came with invisible obligations that everyone had started treating as permanent. She asked me once, "When did you last say no to your sister?" I couldn't answer her. The Thanksgiving where everything broke open was last year. I had offered to host because their apartment was too small and my house was bigger. I said I'd cover the groceries. Just the groceries. That was the offer. Diane said that sounded great. I spent $460 at the grocery store the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Turkey, sides, appetizers, 2 pies, wine. I spent Wednesday evening cooking. I cleaned my house. I set the table with the good dishes. They arrived an hour late. Greg came in, looked around my living room and said, "Nice place, must be nice." He said it like I'd stolen something. Dinner was actually fine at first. My mother was there, my aunt, Diane, and Greg's 2 kids, Lily, who was 8, and Jake, who was 11. We passed dishes, we talked about normal things. Then Jake said something that changed everything. He was talking to Lily quietly, but kids don't actually know how to be quiet. And I heard him say, "Aunt Caroline buys everything for us. Mom says she doesn't have a real life, so she doesn't need money for stuff." The table didn't go silent immediately. It took a second. Then my mother stopped mid-reach. My aunt looked at her wine glass. Diane blinked at her son like she was trying to communicate something with her eyes. And Greg laughed. He actually laughed. A short, easy laugh, and leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, he's not wrong. Caroline doesn't really need a life outside of this. What else is she going to do with all that money?" He gestured around my dining room, my house, my table, my food. I looked at him. I didn't feel the thing I expected to feel, which was humiliation or rage. What I felt was something much quieter. It was the feeling of a decision becoming irreversible, like watching a door close from the other side. I said, "You're right. I've been thinking about that actually," and I smiled. He smiled back, confused, because he'd expected me to look embarrassed. I picked up my fork and kept eating. I was the most relaxed person at that table. After dinner, while Diane was helping the kids with dessert in the kitchen, I sat in the living room with my laptop open. My mother came and sat next to me. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. "Cleaning up some financial stuff," I said. She watched me for a moment. "Caroline." "It's okay, Mom." I wasn't angry when I did it. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I opened the shared accounts one by one. The grocery delivery account first. I removed their access and set a new password. Then the utilities I'd been paying on autopay. I logged into my bank and changed 3 standing transfers to 0. I moved to the Costco membership and removed Greg's name. The streaming services took about 4 minutes total. Then I opened a new email addressed to Diane and attached a document I had saved in a folder I called, and I realized this sounds cold, but it's just how I organize things. Pending resolution. The document was a detailed breakdown of every dollar I had sent or spent on their behalf over 4 years. Mortgage payments, utility bills, insurance, groceries, subscriptions, the Costco runs, the accountant I'd paid for twice. The total was $73,400. I wasn't planning to sue them. I wasn't even planning to ask for it back necessarily. But I needed them to see the number. I needed it to exist somewhere other than my own head, where it had been sitting quietly, growing heavier for years. I hit send. Diane came out of the kitchen about 10 minutes later. She had her phone in her hand and she was looking at it with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, something between confusion and fear. "Caroline, what is this?" "It's a summary," I said, Of what I've contributed since February of the year before last. Greg appeared in the doorway. He read over her shoulder and I watched his face change. The easy confidence drained out of it slowly, like air from a tire. That's, he started. $73,400, I said. Give or take. I'm sure there are some smaller things I missed. You can't just. He stopped. Started again. You did all of that voluntarily. I did, I said, and I'm choosing to stop, also voluntarily. My mother was very still on the couch. My aunt had appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. Diane said, "You're doing this on Thanksgiving? In front of Mom? In front of the kids?" I thought about that for a second. I thought about the dining room table. About Jake's voice. About what Diane had apparently been saying about me in her own home to her own children. "You told your son I don't have a real life," I said. Not accusing, just saying. She opened her mouth, closed it. "I want you to understand something," I said. "I love you. I love those kids. That hasn't changed, but I have been covering your life for 4 years and somewhere along the way it stopped being help and started being expected. And when something becomes expected, apparently it also becomes something people feel comfortable making jokes about at the table I paid for." Greg said, "This is insane. One comment from a kid and you blow everything up?" "Greg," I said, "the comment from your son was the first time anyone in this family said out loud what has apparently been said privately for a long time. I'm actually grateful for it. It clarified something for me." He didn't have an answer for that. The rest of the evening was not pleasant. Diane cried. My mother kept looking between us like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. My aunt quietly started washing dishes in the kitchen, which I respected. Greg went outside and made a phone call, probably to someone who would agree with him, which was fine. I started cleaning up around them. I put away the good dishes, I wiped down the table, I loaded the dishwasher. After about an hour, they left. Diane didn't say goodbye to me, just gathered her kids and her husband and walked out. Jake hugged me before he went, this tight, confused little hug that almost broke me, but I held it together. My mother stayed. She sat at my kitchen table while I finished cleaning, and when I finally sat down across from her, she was quiet for a long time. "I should have said something," she finally said. "To me?" I asked. "Or to them?" She thought about it. "Both. I think to both of you." That was the most honest thing anyone in my family had said to me in 4 years, and I almost started crying right there. But I held it. "I know you were worried about Diane," I said. "I was worried about you too," she said. "I just didn't know how to say it without making it worse." "I know." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Neither of us said anything for a while. The weeks after Thanksgiving were difficult in the way that necessary things often are. Diane tried to rally a couple of family members to her side. "I know because my aunt called me to give me a heads up," said. "She's calling it an ambush," which I found interesting given that nobody had ambushed me when they were cashing my bank transfers. Greg sent me a text on the Monday after that said, essentially that I had overreacted based on one throwaway comment and that he hoped I would reconsider the financial situation given the kids. He mentioned the kids 3 times in 12 sentences. I did not respond. My mother called Diane separately. I don't know everything that was said, but my mother told me afterward that Diane had cried and that somewhere in the crying she had admitted that she'd known it wasn't sustainable, that she'd been scared to address it because she didn't want things to change, that she didn't actually think I had no life. She used the word venting. She'd been venting to her kids about me. I sat with that for a long time. Diane reached out to me in January, not by text, she called, which I thought was brave. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes. We sat across from each other at a place near my office, and she looked tired in a way I recognized. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been running from something and has finally stopped. She said, "I'm sorry, I know that's not enough, but I'm sorry." I didn't rush to absolve her. I let the apology sit there for a moment, which is something my therapist had talked about, giving words room to breathe before you respond to them. Then I said, "I need you to understand what it did to me. Not to make you feel worse, just because I need someone in my family to actually know. She nodded. I told her about the loneliness of it, about how I'd spend weeknights running numbers for their bills instead of doing anything for myself, about how I'd put off a trip to Portugal I'd been saving for, twice, because there was always something more urgent with them, about how I'd started to feel like my worth in our family was entirely transactional, and how terrifying it was to realize that maybe I'd set that up myself. She listened. She didn't defend herself or Greg. She just listened, which was the one thing I had needed for years and hadn't gotten. We didn't fix everything that day. We're not fixed now, if I'm honest. There's work still happening, slowly, in small increments. Greg has a job, a real one, started in December, in operations management at a supply company. I don't know if it was the wake-up call or just timing, and I've learned to stop needing to know that. I haven't resumed the financial support. I helped my sister think through a realistic budget for the first time, with her actually engaged, actually writing things down, not just nodding while I talked. That felt different. That felt like the help I always wanted to give. The trip to Portugal is booked. April. I'm going alone and I cannot wait. What I know now that I didn't know 4 years ago is this. Generosity without boundaries isn't generosity. It's a slow erosion. And the most heartbreaking part is that it erodes both people, the one giving and the one receiving. Greg didn't become that comfortable and dismissive because he was a bad person from the start. He became that way because nothing ever pushed back. Because I kept moving the floor up to meet him. I was so afraid of being the sister who said no that I became something worse, the sister everyone assumed would always say yes. The night of Thanksgiving, after my mother left, I stood in my kitchen alone for a while. My house was clean. The leftovers were put away. Everything was quiet. And I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the house was mine. I've thought a lot about that moment at the dinner table, the one where Jake's voice carried across the room without him understanding what he was carrying. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just repeating what he'd heard at home, the way kids always do. They absorb everything. They repeat everything. And sometimes the thing they repeat is the exact truth that the adults in the room have been too comfortable to say out loud. What struck me afterward wasn't the anger. It was the clarity. Because when Greg laughed and leaned back in my chair at my table, eating food I had bought and cooked, and said what he said, something that had been blurry for 4 years came into focus all at once. I had let this happen, not because I was weak, but because I confused loyalty with obligation and love with the fear of being seen as someone who didn't give enough. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about being taken advantage of by family. It's rarely a story about a villain and a victim. It's a story about someone who wanted to be good and confused goodness with endless giving. I kept moving the line because I told myself that's what good people do. They sacrifice. They show up. They don't say no when there are kids involved and rent is due. But here's what 4 years and 1 Thanksgiving taught me. Real integrity, the kind that actually holds, isn't about how much you give. It's about giving from a place of choice, not fear. The moment I stopped choosing and started just reacting to their next need, I wasn't being generous anymore. I was disappearing, and I had been so focused on keeping their lives afloat that I hadn't noticed how far underwater mine had gotten. The clarity I found, the ability to sit down, open that laptop, and act without rage or drama, that didn't come from nowhere. It came from 4 years of quietly tracking every payment, every promise, every quietly erosion of what I'd originally agreed to. I hadn't known I was preparing, but some part of me had been paying attention the whole time, filing things away, building the case even before I knew I'd need it. That kind of awareness, knowing your own situation precisely, refusing to look away from numbers even when they're uncomfortable. That's what gave me the ground to stand on when the moment finally came. And the courage to actually do it. To not wait for a better time, a calmer setting, a moment when no one would be hurt or caught off guard. Because here's the truth, there is no good time to stop being someone's financial cushion. Someone will always be inconvenienced. Someone will always call it an overreaction. Greg called it that within 24 hours, but I'd already decided that his comfort was no longer my responsibility. Diane and I are still working through it. Some weeks are easier than others. But the conversation we had at that coffee shop in January, where she actually sat still and listened, that was more real than anything we'd shared in years. That's where I saw my sister again, underneath all the avoidance and fear. The trip to Portugal is in April. I booked a window seat. I don't tell this story to make Greg look bad or to prove anything. I tell it because I spent 4 years believing that the most important thing I could offer my family was money. It took one careless sentence from an 11-year-old to show me that what I'd actually been offering was my silence. And silence, it turns out, is the most expensive thing you can give away.